Hi there, my name is Orestes Ponce de Leon, and you are listening to the Cobra Effect podcast. In this show, I cover the unintended consequences of government policies throughout history. We delve into 4,000 years of how even the best intentioned ideas can backfire, leading to revolt, failure, and shocking events. In this episode, we travel 700 years to the Mali Empire in West Africa. In the year 1312, Muhammad ibn Ku, the 8th Mansa, meaning ruler or emperor in the Maninka language, decided to reach the end of the Atlantic Ocean. After a previous failed expedition, he took 2,000 boats, 1,000 for himself and his men, and 1,000 for water and provisions. Then, the next emperor, Mansa Musa, recounts the following. That was the last we saw of him and all those who were with him. And so, I became king in my own right. Perhaps Muhammad ibn Ku did not navigate the Atlantic, and Mansa Musa fabricated the story to justify and legitimize his own ascension to the throne. We will never know. Mansa Musa, the 9th ruler of the Mali Empire, is a protagonist of our episode. His good deeds in foreign lands are perhaps some of the first evidence in history of how an altruistic idea can cause adverse unintended consequences. There are such examples in our world today in what we call foreign aid, cases when the generosity of wealthy nations and international organizations can cause adverse effects among those impoverished communities they aim to help. We will talk a bit more about this at the end of the episode after discussing the events related to Mansa Musa. We will also talk a bit about the California gold rush of the 19th century. Lord of the Wangara mines and 9th Mansa, Mansa Musa I ruled the Empire of Mali between 1312 and 1337. It was one of the largest empires in all of Africa up to that moment, a territory that today corresponds totally or partially to a long list of countries: Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia, and Senegal. Part of the empire was the city of Timbuktu, famous for its mosques and for being one of the centers of scholarship in the medieval Muslim world. Although it is impossible to assess Mansa Musa's riches with certainty, thanks to trade in gold, salt, copper, ivory, and tribute from vassal kingdoms, some estimates suggest that his wealth would be equivalent to around $400 billion today, making him the wealthiest man in history. To put it in perspective, as of the moment I record this episode in mid-2025, Elon Musk's fortune is close to this amount, but his wealth is volatile as it was half the amount a year ago. Even those who are at the top of the wealth list today, such as Jeff Bezos, Larry Page, or Mark Zuckerberg, are worth a bit more than half of what Mansa Musa owned. Even legendary names such as the Rothschild and Rockefeller families are worth today the equivalent of $350 and $340 billion, respectively. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. In 1324, as a devout Muslim, Mansa Musa embarked on a pilgrimage to Mecca, what Muslims refer to as the Hajj. Just 20-something years before, another Malian ruler, Mansa Sakura, had been killed while returning from the Hajj. This time, this is probably why Mansa Musa did not pack lightly. Some estimates suggest that his caravan comprised 8,000 soldiers and courtiers, 12,000 slaves, each with 4 pounds of gold, and 100 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of gold. For greater spectacle, another 500 servants preceded the caravan, and each one carried a gold staff of between 6 and 10.5 pounds. In total, when adding up the estimated amounts of gold, Mansa Musa carried around 40 tons of gold. As of today, mid-2025, this is equivalent to carrying on camelback from one side of the African continent to the other the equivalent of the gold reserves in the central banks of Finland or Bulgaria or Malaysia. Some accounts even mention a total of 60,000 men in this procession, which significantly increases the amount of gold carried by Mansa Musa. On his way to Mecca, upon arriving in Cairo and visiting the Sultan Al-Malik al-Nasir for the first time, Mansa Musa gave him 50,000 gold dinars as a gesture of appreciation. To provide a rough idea, considering that the dinar weighed 4.5 grams and had a gold purity of between 22 and 24 carats, at today's gold price, this would be the equivalent to almost $30 million. I am referring to the current value of gold per se, not the purchasing power of those 50,000 gold dinars in the year 1324. In any case, it is surprising that Musa would hand over a fortune to the Sultan just to say hi. In turn, the Sultan offered a palace to the Mansa of Mali as a sign of hospitality, and there, Mansa Musa stayed with his thousands of companions for the next 3 months. The next day after he arrived in Cairo, Mansa Musa began receiving visits from the city's most distinguished people, including the Caliph of Baghdad, who was formerly the leader of all faithful Muslims. He also went to meet with architects, engineers, jurists, philosophers, and even the ambassadors of Venice and Genoa. All of them received a royal present from the generous Mansa of Mali: gold coins, or gold nuggets, or gold dust. The Egyptian historian Al-Makrizi, who was born 40 years after these events, tells us that, and I quote, "His gifts amazed the eye with their beauty and splendor." End of quote. Mansa Musa also befriended the chief of protocol of the Egyptian Sultan, who facilitated contact with the principal merchants of Cairo. These merchants sold chandeliers, maps, beautifully decorated scientific and religious books, and even 5 extremely rare compasses imported from China, which Mansa Musa personally bought. Needless to say, all these products were handsomely paid for with pure raw gold. The emissaries of the Malian emperor visited the city's bazaars and purchased many products, including incense, myrrh, porcelain, and silk. To the amazement and joy of the sellers, they were all also paid in gold. Mansa Musa and his entourage were paying what we know today as tourist prices, and they were probably happy to do so. After all, the greater the generosity, the greater the prestige of the Malian Empire. Another part of Musa's generosity was his donations to the poor. You see, there are 5 pillars in Islam. There are 5 practices that are mandatory acts of worship for all Muslims. In order, they are the declaration of faith, the prayer, the zakat, which means charity, fasting, and the 5th is the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage to Mecca Mansa Musa was doing. In addition to the zakat, there is the sadaqah, which means righteousness and refers to the voluntary act of charity. As a devout and extremely wealthy Muslim, it is logical to think that Mansa Musa's donations to the poor were also a big part of his journey. Professor John Goodwin states that Musa, and I quote, gave 20,000 gold pieces in charity, end of quote. Probably gold nuggets. Al-Umari, a contemporary historian who visited Cairo 12 years after Mansa Musa, tells us that, and I quote, this man flooded Cairo with his benefactions and performed many acts of charity and kindness, end of quote. After spending so much on luxury goods and making generous donations, one thought may come to your mind. Where is the catch? After all, this is the Cobra Effect podcast, and these are stories of unintended consequences. You got it right. Combining the information provided by the two historians of around that time, Al-Makrisi and Al-Umari, before Mansa Musa visited Cairo, 1 dinar, the name of the gold coin, was worth 25 or more dirhams, which were the silver coins. Al-Makrisi tells us that after Mansa Musa's visit, and I quote, "The price of the gold dinar was lowered by 6 dirhams," end of quote. This is a 24% loss in value. The other contemporary historian, Al-Umari, tells us that the value of gold, and I quote, "cheapened in price and has remained cheap till now. The dinar does not exceed 22 dirhams or less. This has been the state of affairs for about 12 years until this day by reason of the large amount of gold which they brought into Egypt and spent there." End of quote. So, even 12 years later, Al-Umari tells us that the price of gold was still at least 3 dirhams below its original price when Mansa Musa visited Cairo, which means a loss of 12% or more in those 12 years. The sudden influx of gold caused a long-lasting effect on the value of gold. It is to be expected that, during those 12 years, the city's economy was not doing well either. Unfortunately, we do not have data to quantify the extent to which this increase in the gold supply impacted a rise in general prices and a decline in the purchasing power of gold and money in general. However, we do have a similar phenomenon that occurred in the US in the mid-19th century, the California Gold Rush. We must analyze each historical and economic phenomenon in its specific context. For example, one of the causes of inflation in California was the influx of gold miners, which increased demand and with this, local prices. That being said, during the California Gold Rush, another factor, and almost certainly the most significant, was the sudden growth in the local gold supply that led to inflation and, in turn, a loss of purchasing power for the dollar. You see, and this is an important parenthesis, today in our economy we use fiat money. Our dollars, euros, pesos, and so on are fiat money. Now, fiat money derives its value from our faith in the stability of the issuing government, as well as from supply and demand. For example, one of the most common causes of inflation is an increase in the money supply, the classic definition of too much money chasing too few goods. Let's say we live on an empty island with no resources and we only have 1 coconut and $1. It sounds like a crazy example, but stay with me. That dollar represents the value of the coconut. However, if we start increasing the money supply, if we go crazy on the printing machine and print 4 more dollars, we will end up with $5 on one hand, while on the other, we still have the same coconut, unless we somehow magically multiply coconuts overnight. The coconut will now cost $5 instead of $1 as before. So with $1, I was able to buy 1 coconut. And now, with $1, I am only able to buy a fifth of a coconut. Inflation ends up causing a decline in the currency's purchasing power, and this always affects the poorest the hardest. In an economy, when millions of wages cannot keep pace with the increase in general prices, then we have inflation. Those who suffer the most are the minimum wage workers who see their wages purchasing power reduced to nothing, as in the above example, to a fifth of a coconut. Before fiat money, The value of paper currency was backed by the government's guarantee that you could exchange that piece of paper for gold or silver. In the case of coins, the nominal value of the coin was backed by what the coin was made of, whether gold or silver. This was the case when gold was found in California in 1848 and when Mansa Musa visited Cairo in 1324. Economist Michael D. Bordeaux says, and I quote, "The California gold discovery in 1848 is an example of a monetary shock. The newly produced gold increased the US money supply, which then raised domestic expenditures, nominal income, and ultimately the price level." End of quote. It is the same principle as the island, the coconut, and the $5 I mentioned before. With more gold chasing the same amount of goods and services, general prices increased in California. There was a shortage of US minted dollars to meet the rising needs of the miners. From food and clothing to entertainment, the gold extracted from the mines and rivers became actual money. Backed at a fixed US dollar price by the US government, gold dust became a means of payment. The University of Oxford tells us that during this time in California, and I quote, "Merchants kept scales for weighing the dust that the miners brought them, often in retail quantities, to pay for goods. For some small purchases, the agreed price was a pinch. The buyer would place a small quantity of dust on the counter, and the seller would take as payment as much as he could pick up between his thumb and his forefinger." End of quote. Now, does this remind you of something? Mansa Musa and his emissaries also paid with pure gold while purchasing in the bazaars of Cairo. Let me put it in numbers. I know I am deviating a little bit from Mansa Musa and his visit to Cairo, but what happened in California in the mid-19th century serves as an interesting comparison. In 1850, during the time of the California gold rush, while farmhands earned almost $14 per month in Massachusetts, among the highest wages in the nation, by the way, California farmhands earned $60 per month. So 14 in Massachusetts and 60 in California. However, prices were astronomically higher in California. That same year, the journalist Edward Gould Buffum wrote in his book 6 Months in the Gold Mines about how he paid $43 for a breakfast of 2 in the town of Coloma, California. This is 3 times the monthly wage of a Massachusetts farmhand of the time, and around $1,700 today when comparing the purchasing power of the dollar in 1850. Now, imagine paying $1,700 for just a breakfast of 2. I guess this would be the time to split the bill. Also in 1850, a dozen eggs cost 23 cents in Massachusetts. Meanwhile, in California, the Annals of San Francisco, published in 1855, tells us that, and I quote, "The time soon came when eggs were sold at $1, $2, and $3 a piece." End of quote. Not a dozen for 23 cents as in Massachusetts, but 1 egg for up to $3. Not only did food prices skyrocket, according to Edward Gould Buffum in his book 6 Months in the Gold Mines, a lot on Portsmouth Square in San Francisco was worth $15 in 1845. The gold rush started in January 1848, and by May, the price had jumped to $6,000, and by October, to $40,000. That piece of land went from $15 to $40,000 in no time. To end with this comparison between the California gold rush and Mansa Musa's visit to Cairo, Edward Gould Buffum also wrote in his memoir, and I quote, "On the 18th of October of 1848, I reached San Francisco, where a curious state of things was presented. gold dust and coins were as plentiful as the seashore sands and seemed to be thought as valuable. The merchandise of all descriptions was exceedingly high." End of quote. To put it in simple terms, gold was so abundant that it was worthless, and in consequence, everything was too expensive. Similarly, after Mansa Musa's trail of gold in Cairo in 1324, also plentiful as the seashore sands Edward Gold Buffon described in San Francisco, what if I tell you that the consequences of Musa's generosity did not end with the most likely increase in prices? The story gets even better. Professor John Goodwin tells us the following, and I will quote the whole paragraph because, of course, this is pure gold. "The chroniclers of Cairo give a far less happy picture. With all his gold, his gifts, and his trading, King Mansa Musa had upset the greatest gold market of the medieval world. As he left Cairo, Mecca, and Medina, prices rocketed as everyone tried to pay in depreciated gold. However, Musa had not made ample provision for his return journey. On reaching Cairo once again, he borrowed back all the gold he could get. The moneylenders were happy. They lent at a high rate of interest. The value of gold mounted to unprecedented heights. Prices dropped accordingly. All went well until Musa got back to Mali. He immediately repaid the vast loan plus interest in a single astounding payment. The moneylenders were ruined as the price of gold fell through the floor. For the first and last time, one man had played ducks and drakes with the world price of gold. Gold dust was dust indeed." End of quote. For the second time, Mansa Musa's good intentions did more harm than good. A detail often missing from the sources and online articles regarding Mansa Musa's 1324 visit to Cairo is that, at the time, Cairo was one of the most populated cities in the world and one of the wealthiest. While Cairo had a population of between 500 and 600,000 people, Paris was likely the most populated European city, ranging from 150 to 200,000 inhabitants. That is a third of Cairo's population. If Mansa Musa's transfer of wealth, let's say generous transfer of wealth, disrupted the economy of a city such as Cairo, then we have an idea of how massive the influx of gold was. After returning to Mali, news of Musa's kindness was not covered kindly. Malian griots, who were West African storytellers, historians, and praise singers, did not praise him that much, even to this day, despite the fact that Mansa Musa is perhaps the most famous of Malian emperors. In an interview for the BBC, Lucy Duran of the School of African and Oriental Studies in London says that, and I quote, "He gave out so much Malian gold along the way that griots don't like to praise him in their songs because they think he wasted local resources outside the empire." End of quote. As a result of unintended consequences, and despite Mansa Musa's good intentions, this may be the first case of failed foreign aid in history. It is not that foreign aid causes inflation. The specific case of the depreciation of the value of gold after Musa's visit to Cairo is just but one unexpected consequence in a case of transfer of cash to a foreign country. The beneficial prices offered to local merchants, along with the donations and gifts given by Mansa Musa, represented a transfer of wealth with a resemblance to programs implemented in modern times, such as development assistance to poor countries. The Encyclopedia Britannica defines foreign aid as, and I quote, "the international transfer of capital, goods, or services from a country or international organization for the benefit of the recipient country or its population." End of quote. This transfer of capital, goes from developed countries via private charities, but mostly government agencies. It also happens via international organizations, such as the United Nations and its many agencies, or the World Bank, for example. This all began after World War II and the Marshall Plan in Europe, but it gained momentum in the late 1950s and 1960s as decolonization was underway in Africa and Asia. It was a way to win the support of ordinary people in poor countries while stopping the influence of the Soviet Union and communism. It then expanded to Latin America in the following decades, and it is now even present in former communist countries in Europe, such as Albania and Moldova. The answer to the question of whether foreign aid works for those impoverished nations has long been debated. In 2005, Jeffrey Sachs, a well-meaning economist, argued in his book The End of Poverty that if rich countries committed $195 billion of foreign aid a year, global extreme poverty could be eradicated by 2025. Also taking notice of the role of markets, Sachs mainly advocates for more financial development aid from wealthy countries to achieve this goal. Contrary to Jeffrey Sachs' argument for increased spending on international development aid, fellow economist William Easterly responded that, and I quote, "The West has spent $2.3 trillion on foreign aid over the last 5 decades. It is a tragedy that so much well-meaning compassion did not bring the results for people in need." End of quote. This sparked a fascinating debate that continues to this day. I am leaving all the relevant links in the transcript for this episode. International relief in cases of natural disasters or assistance to fight epidemics and diseases are valid and necessary in my opinion. But when it comes to financial assistance for medium and long-term development, the critical voices argue that the flow of capital from developed countries only fuels the corruption of recipient governments, diminishes the accountability of these governments to precisely the people most in need, and postpones the necessary reforms for these countries to successfully integrate themselves into international trade under local sound democratic institutions and economies free of bureaucratic burdens. These are necessary reforms not only to end poverty, but most importantly, to bring prosperity. I will also leave in the transcript relevant links to each of these critical voices. Precisely among them are voices coming from countries that are recipients of foreign aid, such as economists George Ajite, Dambisa Moyo, and Deepak Lal. In future episodes, we will visit more examples of the Cobra effect in foreign aid. It is not a matter of giving up on solidarity, but of learning and being more effective in the noble task of helping those in need. It is not that simple, and although it may not seem so, sometimes generosity can be counterproductive, as Mansa Musa's story illustrates. Thank you for listening. For additional information and social media links, you can visit thecobraeffectpodcast.com. You can support the show on Buy Me a Coffee or become a monthly member. Links on the website. You help me to cover my costs, and your contribution keeps this project going. Feel free to also reach out via social media or email. The email address is contact@thecobraeffectpodcast.com. I would like to hear your questions, comments, or ideas for a future topic. See you in 2 weeks for another episode of the Cobra Effect Podcast.